So welcome to number 3 of Red Reviews with my friend Justin Clark. So what do you got for us this week?
Well, thank you, Corey. I'm really looking forward to today's episode because so far we've kind of talked about a book that I really liked. I've talked about a book I really didn't like. And now we're going to talk about a book that, in my opinion, is an indispensable classic. So today we're going to be talking about Inventing Reality, The Politics of Mass Media by Michael Parenti, which was originally published in 1986, and a second edition was published in 1993, which is the edition that I read. Okay. It's almost impossible to try to find a book, like a hard copy of this book, so I got an ebook version and I read that. And this book is a Marxist critique of the mainstream media, particularly in the United States, and the ways in which it sort of, in his phrase, invents reality. And so to give you some interesting context, so Michael Parenti, who is still alive, I think he's in his 90s, maybe 80s or 90s, is a political philosopher. He got his PhD, I think, at Yale, but he is a Marxist scholar. And sort of like, I guess the best parallel is like Noam Chomsky is for anarchism what Michael Parenti is for Marxism.
Okay.
And so I guess that's kind of what you could say, is that he is very much in that vein. He's a critic of U.S. empire. He's a critic of mass media culture. He's written, I think, a couple books on this. One we're going to be talking about, Inventing Reality. He wrote another one called Make Believe Media, which is, I think, his critique of like film and television, which I haven't read. But he's best known for his book, Black Shirts and Reds, which is a collection of essays that goes through and sort of dispels some common myths and misunderstandings about the rise of fascism, and then the decline of the Soviet Union, the decline of real existing communism in the world.
I think I might have heard people talking about that book before on something that I was watching or listening to.
It's a classic as well, and I just finished reading that as well, so we can always do that in another Red Review at some point. Sure. But this is the first book I read of Michael Parenti's, largely because I find it very interesting that there are two books about a critique of the media, particularly the mass media in the United States, that come out relatively around the same time. So Michael Parenti's book comes out in 1986. And then the more popular book that kind of everybody knows is Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, which came out in 1988. The main difference, I think, between the two books is that while the latter was sort of has what Chomsky and Herman call like the propaganda model. So Parenti doesn't really do that. It's more of a broader statement about the ways in which political economy shapes media production. And so he spends an incredible amount of time sort of laying out, multiple themes about how multiple different concepts. So he first talks about like the ways in which media conglomerates function. So the way that they sort of corporate consolidation. He talks about the ways in which journalists and television producers often do what he basically calls self-censorship, which actually happens a lot more than you think.
For sure.
And a lot of it is related to economic interests. And then he also spends, I think, the sort of back half of the book talking about the ways in which the media sort of props up U.S. empire. And he has specific case studies where he talks about the ways in which the U.S. media basically will always find a way to malign left-wing movements around the globe. So he sort of spends some time talking about the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the way in which the U.S. media sort of impugned that movement for socialism, and the way in which they sort of supported Reagan's propping up of the Contras, which were these right-wing militias or death squads that were sort of fighting against the Sandinista government. Reagan famously referred to them as like akin to the founding fathers. He spends a considerable amount of time talking about the invasion of Grenada, which happened in the early 1980s under Reagan as well, and how they were trying to set up this sort of eco-friendly socialist state within this island of Grenada. And how there was this sort of lame media story about hostages that wasn't really particularly true. But that was sort of like the sort of remember the main moment that sort of, the Lusitania movement that got people interested in sort of pushing for war. And then in the revised edition, he includes the first war in Iraq, the Gulf War, Desert Storm, and the way in which the U.S. media pretty much consolidated in support of the war effort, and that dissenting voices were often shut out, which is something we very much saw with the second invasion of Iraq in 2003. Yeah. One example he doesn't have in the book, because the book is obviously was published in 1983, but a decade later with the second invasion of Iraq, one of the most popular and well-known television personalities throughout the late 80s and into the early 2000s was Phil Donahue. And Phil Donahue had an MSNBC show, like I think it was an hour-long show or whatever, and his show was canceled because he was one of the few mainstream media voices on cable news to critique the motives of the Iraq War. And Parenti has numerous examples in the books of journalists who get silenced, or they get fired, or they get pushed to a crappy sort of desk within a newspaper because they're trying to actually actively do journalism.
Right.
And one of the, I think, the main takeaways from his book is thinking about how the sort of traditional liberal critique of the media is like, well, it's flawed, but it could be better. Or it's like, well, they make mistakes. And it's like, his whole thing is like, they don't actually make mistakes. Like or if they do, they make, that's not really the point. Like the big things that people think of as being mistakes, whether it's like buying into the lie of weapons of mass destruction, or like buying into the lie that happened with the first Gulf War. Cause there's a very legendary story about how babies were thrown out of incubators in Iraq. During the first Gulf War, and that never happened. It just flat out never happened. And the young girl that they brought to testify into the U.S. Congress to say that this happened just so happened to be like the daughter of like some high up person within like the Saudi government or something like that. I mean, basically the firsthand testimony was spurious at best because it wasn't a reliable source. It was sort of propaganda, right? And so, I think ultimately, the thing I find interesting is that, so the sort of Chomsky-Herman model is sort of manufacturing consent, right? Built within the Chomsky-Herman model itself is still this idea that like they're manufacturing consent, and yes, they're telling lies, but they're also trying to like fix the system itself, or that ultimately it's a flawed mechanism based on corporate power.
But the truth is there, and it's kind of
but the truth is there. And Parenti kind of takes it a little bit farther and says, actually, I give you all that. That's absolutely true. But a lot of times what they do is they don't so much lie so much as they leave information out, which is sort of like lying by omission. Right. Yeah. Or like sort of lying by commission, where they'll sort of put like a fact in between two sort of falsehoods or stretches of the truth. Okay. And it's all in service of the U.S. empire, essentially. So when he says what liberals do is they often go, well, it could be bad, but it can be reformed, or it can be better. It doesn't work. It's kind of not functioning. To a leftist critique, which is that actually, no, this system is working as intended, and it's serving the interests of the corporate class and the war state. Like that's it. It serves its function perfectly.
But right. Yeah. I think of like, as a modern kind of example, there's, okay, so it's a little controversial to say that the Uyghurs genocide is not happening, or it's questionable, right? Yeah. But there's some very good analysis going on by people who are saying, well, the source for all of these stories, or most of these stories, is this one guy who happens to be this business owner in this position. And it's like, okay, so like this is, I mean, it's meant to do something so that it feeds the empire, like you say, like, and I believe that obviously, I think there's evidence that China is committing some human rights atrocities. Sure. But where are we going with that is the question. Is the media aiming us towards war? Or is it, is the purpose of us hearing about it as a genocide and framing it in this way, is this the purpose of this to say, hey, let's fight against China.
Yeah. And I would argue that it is, because if you look at the absolute moral hypocrisy of the mainstream media within the last few days, I mean, you've seen, so they'll sort of talk about how we need to defend the Uyghur Muslims within Xinjiang province, but at the same time, they will also like sort of do hand-wringing and moral equivocation when it comes to Palestine.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, so these Muslims count, but these Muslims don't.
Right.
And here's the reason that these Muslims count, because bringing this up is in service of U.S. empire, and these Muslims don't because it doesn't serve our interests. Right.
Yeah.
And so and again, that gets back to the core of what Parenti is writing about in Inventing Reality, which is this idea that the media exists as the stenographer of power. It exists solely to maintain the system that ultimately pays the bills, right? So,
right.
And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of share with you some quotes, a quote about sort of foreign policy and thinking about how we've sort of talked about the ways in which the sort of the field of acceptable opinion within the United States, particularly when it comes to discussions of whether it's police brutality or foreign or U.S. empire or corporate power, it's very narrow, right? So even the people who might be on the left, who are in the sort of political spectrum on mainstream news outlets, often they are sort of left liberals at best. I mean,
right.
Maybe they'll have a DSA member, but like you're never going to get somebody who is explicitly like a Marxist or a Marxist-Leninist or like an anarchist beyond maybe say like Noam Chomsky, which again, even Chomsky himself doesn't really get mainstream interviews anymore. I mean, he just doesn't.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think a lot of it has to do with the Iraq War. I mean, I think if you look at the way in which Chomsky was treated post the Iraq War, he's clearly not getting on MSNBC, he's not getting on CNN. The only time that these people ever talk about Chomsky is every 2 to 4 years when he comes out and says, vote for the lesser of two evils, right? That's the only time they'll ever cover what he says.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
He also is pretty outspoken on Israel and Palestine.
Yep.
So that's a pretty major issue. I think that's one of the things I mean, we're kind of getting off the topic of the book, but
not really. I mean, it's relevant.
Somebody once told me that I shouldn't listen to Noam Chomsky because he's a racist and an anti-Semite.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, what? But that's the line that is being fed to right-wing media and even mainstream media in a lot of ways, because you have to toe the Israel line.
Yes.
If you want to be on media.
And the main thing that I think is a huge issue within discourse regarding Israel is that there's this sort of conflating of Jewishness with Zionism, right? Yeah. And to me, those are two very different things. There are people who are Israelis, who maybe have been born Israelis, or who are Jewish, who are anti-Zionists, right? Then there are Gentiles who are anti-Zionist, right? Yep. And I would kind of count myself in that book, mainly just because for me, again, it's not an issue of, I don't believe, and I think maybe this is controversial. I don't know. I mean, I think it is, but like basically, I don't believe that a state should exist to serve a religion or to serve a religious class or a religious group. Right. And in fact, Marx even criticized this kind of thinking in an essay that's extremely controversial to people because they don't get it. They don't realize part of it is irony. The other part of it is in sort of critiquing this. He wrote an essay called On the Jewish Question, where he lays out why Jewish people should never let go of their Jewishness, but what they should do is sort of embrace secularism and not try to separate themselves out and signal themselves out as being Jewish. And he sort of lays out why. A lot of people use this essay to sort of claim that Marx is an anti-Semite, and that's not true. But it's or at the very least, it's they're blowing it out of proportion. Needless to say, I think what's very important here, because this is an extremely hot topic, is that regardless of wherever you land on the spectrum, whether you're a Zionist or not, one of the things I think we can agree on is that it's a huge problem to set up a country where you basically, the people who had lived there for forever, right, who have just as much of a sort of nationalistic claim to the land as you do, right, the Palestinians, because that whole issue started with Palestine being a sort of a part of the British Empire. And then around World War I, you had the Balfour Declaration, where the British government essentially guaranteed Israel to the Israelis, right?
Right.
To the Jews, and then that was never carried out, right? It was never fulfilled, and then the Holocaust happened. So, like, I understand the desire for the Jewish people to have their own home, and I understand that, right? And that's the part of Zionism I understand, and I can empathize with, and I can agree with. My big problem is that building of your own state for your own people should not come at the expense and the subjugation and ethnic cleansing of another people. And that to me is the huge issue.
Yeah.
And I find it to be really distressing that a people who are ancestors of people who died in the Holocaust would then instigate some kind of policy on their own that in many ways recalls some of its worst horrors in terms of the ethnic cleansing. But that's what happens when you set up Israel, which is a settler colonial state. That's what it is, right? Yeah. And if you look at the history of Israel, it's not that different from the history of the United States. The United States is also a settler colonial state. Canada is a settler colonial state. Yep. And what did they do? They pushed out the native people. And in this case, the United States, was the absolute genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Native Americans. That's what we did. And we built our country on top of theirs and forced them out or killed them. And that's exactly what's happening in Israel. And this has nothing to do with them being Jewish. It has everything to do with the mindset of nationalism and settler colonialism.
Yeah, exactly.
And to conflate that complex phenomena with you hate Jews is disgusting. And so I try very hard to be very explicit about criticism of Israel as a state, the ideology that brought it into being as a state, which is separate from Jewishness. You know, people are Jewish who are not Zionists, right? Yep. And explicit, because if we're not, then we can fall into tropes of anti-Semitism, and that's a problem. I hope that wasn't too much off base, but you know, that's my take on it.
I think it's perfect. I mean, part of these book reviews is it's going to create conversations, right? And I think that's one of the fundamental things is that we need to make sure we're defending people, not necessarily states, and we can critically analyze what states do without saying we should go to war and without saying that we should wipe somebody off the face of the planet. And you know, we can walk these nuanced conversations, and we can do it intentionally. We don't have to just hop onto whatever the media wants us to follow in. Yeah.
And Parenti would argue a lot of that is the way in which we talk about Israel, very much like the way we talk about U.S. empire, is you have these sort of shibboleths or these sort of moral signposts that people put up that sort of narrows acceptable opinion. Right. And when we're talking about like the U.S. military complex, we're talking about our support of sort of brutal regimes or harmful regimes like Saudi Arabia or Israel. Our continued support of dictators throughout much of American history, especially the 20th century, that, well, people say, oh, well, you just hate freedom or you hate America or whatever, right? And so there's like a quote that from the book that I think is really instructive of this. So Parenti says, quote, "The mainstream media began with the unexamined premise that U.S. foreign policy is above reproach, except for operational criticisms as to its efficacy. Therefore, if masses of demonstrators and rioters in other countries denounce that policy as imperialistic and oppressive, it can only be because they suffer from anti-Americanism. Anti-Americanism, that is, they have an inexplicable hatred of America and Americans. Anti-Americanism is treated as an irrational hostility towards the American people, rather than a possibly justified hostility toward the imposing and oppressive nature of U.S. policies." And I think that is right. I mean, I think that's what what he's getting at there is the thing that we heard all the time during Bush 43's presidency.
They hate us because we're free.
They hate us for our freedom. They hate us for our freedom. Yeah. No, they don't. Like most people who they don't hate like Americans. Like I don't think most like people who live over there who hate U.S. empire like hate me individually as a person.
Right.
But what they hate is the system. And I think like that's important. It's important to understand that like the difference between a sort of liberal critique or a sort of even a conservative critique versus a radical or leftist critique is what I said earlier, which is that the way that sort of liberals and even mainline conservatives often look at the problems within the media is, well, it's individual actors, right? Right. And that if we can just, or it's like, oh, it's just the liberal media, like it's a huge problem. There's a whole chapter in the book devoted to how this concept of the liberal media is nonsense and how in many ways the U.S. media system is very right-wing and it's been propped up by it has propped up right-wing politics for years.
It's owned by billionaires.
It's owned by billionaires. And then the public broadcasting itself is largely controlled by billionaires. I mean, people don't realize how much money the Kochs have in PBS or in NPR. Yeah. Which is like when people make the joke that NPR is just Fox News for people who like to hike, which I think is kind of funny. But anyway, so yeah, it's this narrowing of opinion or shutting out of opinions based on the dynamics of the economics of running a news business.
Right.
So say, for example, and a good example of this, and this is a generalized example from the book, is imagine that you're sort of a beat reporter and you come across a story about a company that's pouring toxic chemicals in a river and it's killing local ecosystems and it's making kids really sick because they're swimming in it and they're getting sick. And you want to write a story about this and you're kind of the local beat reporter or whatever. And you write the story and it's good and your sources are solid and you have good evidence to prove that this is going on. And you take it to your editor and the editor says, we can't run this. Yeah. And you're like, why? Why can't we run this? And it's because the company that you're criticizing has a stake in our company and we cannot be openly critical of them in public. Yeah. We can't run something too critical. Right. Which is why you'll never see the Washington Post ever criticize Amazon, really. Right. Because it's owned by Jeff Bezos, right? You're never really going to see Vox.com ever criticize Comcast because one of the single largest investors in Vox.com is Comcast. Yeah. Also Bill Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And because Bill Gates actually has a substantial stake in Comcast. So that's why with Vox.com, you see all these like glowing pieces about how wonderful fucking Bill Gates is, right? Or if they are minimally critical, it's only about process, right? The process critique, which is what Parenti's getting at in that quote. Like the way that sort of mainstream liberals or mainstream centrists within sort of corporate media, when they'll talk about U.S. foreign policy, they don't often talk about like the stated goals or they don't talk about like what the actual value of doing it is. They don't actually sort of ask the base moral questions. Okay. What they really do is talk about the process. So they'll talk about like, well, this whole process isn't working right now. We need more troops or we need less troops or we need to do a no-fly zone or we don't need to do a no-fly zone or you'll hear this all the time. This is something the guys at Citations Needed podcast talk about all the time is this idea of like a quagmire. We're in a quagmire in Iraq or we're in a quagmire in Vietnam. And what Parenti makes a point of saying is that for the U.S. empire, you know, wars like Vietnam and wars like Iraq were extremely successful. You know, they destroyed the native government. They led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And it led to, you know, basically the United States being able to chop up parts of the world and sell it to the highest bidder. So the defense contractors won out, the oil companies won out, and the major shareholders of the Fortune 500 made out. The only people that didn't were the native Iraqis and the American people and the soldiers that died in the service of their empire.
Right.
So like that's what moves it is that when you sort of talk about individual actors being bad or the process critique, when you move to an actual systemic critique and say, actually, no, the media works to serve those in power and that it will do everything in its power to defend the U.S. empire and to defend the corporate state from any kind of criticism or any kind of real pushback.
Right.
But that's, I mean, and ultimately, like the big thing is to get a sense of it is it's like one of the really great short quotes, but it sort of echoes the title of the book, which is he says, thus, corporate interests not only structure the way the media report reality, they structure much of reality itself. And I think that's super important to understand, that so much of what we live through every single day, regardless of how radical we think we are, is constantly mediated through corporate control. There's very little that you can actually think about within a given time period in your life where you're not constantly inundated by propaganda, corporate propaganda specifically, which today they call public relations or marketing. But that's, right. Because propaganda fell out of favor. Even though the founder of the field, a guy named Edward Bernays, who was a relative of Sigmund Freud, literally wrote a book called Propaganda in, about 100 years ago, where he lays out some of his techniques. And that would become the modern public relations business. And so when he says it controls much of reality itself, that's right, in the sense that so much of what we end up understanding is mediated through these corporate structures, regardless of whether or not we try to be independent. And media, even that we think of as being independent, often will sometimes even parrot the line of the Defense Department, because most major newspapers, whether it's the Washington Post, especially the Washington Post and the New York Times, they're essentially, when they write articles, a lot of times the inside sources are people within the DOD, the Defense Department, or the Pentagon, who have given them leaked information, or they're just basically expanded versions of Defense Department press releases.
Right, yeah.
So it's very little of it is, and they'll write, and think about that and I guess the takeaway for this episode is, when you're reading media, when you're reading newspaper articles, if you're watching YouTube, if you're watching corporate news, think about the ways in which they talk about certain things. Look when they use passive voice. Like when they'll say, like, a headline will be like 9 died in clashes in Gaza, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's like, well, that's kind of passive. It doesn't actually say what happened, which is usually what is the case, which is that IDF forces killed 9 people, but they're not going to say that, right? Because that doesn't look good. And so, that's the thing you have to think about. And so because it structures much of reality itself, you have to constantly fight back.
The funny thing, like there's also a book I have, it's called Seeing Red, and it goes through the history of indigenous peoples or native peoples in Canadian media, and the way that they framed the indigenous peoples, and the way that has impacted the public view of those people. And it's the same thing, right? It's the same thing that we used to hear about how they would discuss the color of a black man who was wanted by the police, where they wouldn't discuss the color of a white guy or whatever. They would frame things in certain ways. And these are all, and even the choice of what stories to cover and which stories not to cover, it all paints a picture of a media that is controlling how people think. And I mean, when you say it that way, it sounds conspiratorial, but it's literally the way that things work.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that, because there's actually a chunk of the book where Parenti makes that exact point, which is that when you often bring this up and you talk about this way with some people, they will often call you a conspiracy theorist. And then he brings up the correct point of saying that, like, that some conspiracies are true, right? Like, that the CIA actually did run drugs in Central and South America, like that really happened. The fact that the United States government actually did perform horrific syphilis experiments on African Americans without their knowledge. Like, there are real conspiracies. And arguments against conspiracy theorists would be a lot easier if governments would stop doing shady shit. Yes, absolutely, right? And the thing is this is the point that Parenti gets home, and this is something I agree with too, which is that, why are conspiracy theories so powerful? Why do they profligate? One, sometimes it's because they are true. They are objectively true, whether it's COINTELPRO or MKUltra or other shit, right?
Yeah.
But the other part of it is, what is the thing about conspiracy theories that is valuable? Even the most outlandish ones. It's people are thinking systemically, which is how people on the left think.
Yeah.
The way that liberals and conservatives often think about the world is it's just a bunch of random individuals fighting against one another for their own self-interest, and everything's kind of chaotic. And you'll hear phrases like, well, it's complicated or it's complex and this kind of shit. Reality, sometimes it actually isn't that complex. if you understand systems analysis. And I think us on the left, whether you're an anarchist or a Marxist, you understand things systemically. And when you explain things to people systemically, you often get painted as a conspiracy theorist.
It sounds conspiratorial.
It does sound conspiratorial, but it's not, because, it's as Parenti would say, it's rational means that are pursuing irrational ends that ultimately are irrational ends, right? Like, for those in power, pursuing, another conflict in the Middle East is rational to them, because they genuinely believe that, I think some of these people do genuinely believe that the United States is like a beacon of hope for the world, and that we are this light of democracy, and we can, like, people genuinely believe that, right? Yeah. And so I don't think everyone's completely cynical. I do think people have some genuine beliefs, and those are acted upon, but they're acted upon within systems, and the systems themselves reinforce what ideology can become. Yeah. And so, I think that's what's important. So, like, I'm not condoning people, like, believe in, like, the earth being flat and shit. It's not my point.
Right.
My point is that with conspiracy, unless it's completely outlandish like that, when it comes to government, it's really important to actually look at the evidence and see what it is. And because a lot of times the United States has done horrible things and in the name of U.S. interests, which is their sort of PC way of saying empire. Right. And so don't discount the systemic way of thinking, because that's the separation between sort of normies and people like us. We don't see things as just random individuals hacking it out in the ether. With no rhyme or reason. We do see the systemic things around us. Yeah,
like I even was thinking the other day, like you can, even an individual person's situation, you cannot analyze it without analyzing the systems surrounding that person.
Yep.
You have to examine everything that is going on that causes them to be in poverty or addicted to drugs or committing crimes. You have to actually look at all of this stuff. You can't just say, oh, well, that person's a criminal or a drug addict, right?
Yeah. And that doesn't negate individual responsibility or the role of the individual within society. I'm reading a classic essay right now by Russian Marxist Georgy Plekhanov, which is called The Role of the Individual in History. And he talks about sort of situating how individual actors work within history from a Marxist perspective. And it goes back to Marx's great, sort of paraphrase of Hegel, where from the 18th Brumaire, where Marx says, men make history, but not in the conditions of their choosing. And I think that's right. I think that we all do have some level of agency within our lives, but that agency is, again, much like the media, is mediated through institutions. And it's important for us to understand that, like, we are a part of systems that are much larger and much more powerful than we are. And so, I know it's like cliche to say, but sometimes, like, when you look at the world like this, it's kind of like you've been pulled out of the Matrix and you kind of see shit
a little bit.
It really is, right?
If only they hadn't ruined the term red pill.
Yeah, red pill. I was trying to say all of that without saying red pill, even though the Matrix trilogy is a trans allegory, which is, but it's like, but yeah, I think that's true. Or I think an even better example, well, not an even better example, but a great example, and one of my all-time favorite movies is John Carpenter's They Live. From 1988 with Roddy Piper, right?
Yeah.
And he finds the special glasses, and without them, he sees the world as the systems want him to. But when he puts the glasses on, he sees the world for what it is, which is, it says like breed, consume, buy, and then he finds out that like half the population are like, weird looking aliens, right? and and of course, anybody who's ever watched like Zizek's Pervert's Guide to Ideology, they know that like what he's talking about is ideology, right? And the goal is not so much like to just take the glasses off and just see the world as it is, because no one can. That's impossible. But the goal is to get you a better set of glasses.
Yeah.
And so, you take off your sort of normie shit liberal glasses, and then you put on, ooh, I got my Kropotkin glasses, or ooh, I got my Marx glasses on, or in my case, I got my Parenti glasses on, and you start seeing the world a little bit differently, because we're all going to be mediated by ideology. That's just the name of the game. The question is, which ideology do you believe in? Is it one in service of power, or is it in service of the people? And so like it, to me, that's kind of the view of it, and why, Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality is a classic book. And I think anybody who's interested in critiques of the media, anybody who's read Manufacturing Consent should read this book, because I think they're great companion pieces. And it's a classic book, 5 out of 5 on the Goodreads. And
Nice.
it's a classic book, indispensable. Should be on everybody's bookshelf, although it's really hard to find a physical copy, so get you an ebook online.
So 5 out of 5 for Michael.
5 out of 5.
Book?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a classic book. And then I think next time, if I finish it, I don't remember exactly what I have on the schedule for next time. Let's see what I have. Ooh, yes. Next time, we will be talking about the book The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton.
Oh, nice.
Which is all about modern monetary theory, which I think we've talked about before.
I'm looking forward to that.
And so we're going to be talking about the book and about how deficits really don't matter, and the whole sort of deficit trolling complex, and her experience working in government. That's a great book. So,
Yeah.
And then some future books kind of down the line. If you're interested in this new segment, I'll be covering Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. And then one that I'm finishing up right now that I'm really excited about doing at some point is The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which I just read for the first time.
Cool.
And then another book we'll probably be doing in a few weeks is this book called Americana, which is a history of American capitalism.
Oh, nice.
So we've got a whole bunch of stuff in the queue. And if you're interested in more of what I do, you can check me out on Instagram at Justin Clark PH for public history. And you can check out my website, justinclark.org.
Cool. Well, thank you for this review.
Yeah, this was a lively one. This was a fun one. It was a good back and forth,
Yeah,
which
for
was
sure.
good for me, because I was always worried. I'm like, will I have enough prepared? But yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to next time.